From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I know this country is exhausted by and with politics. I know that the cost of living crisis drew a veil over the joy and wonder in our lives, and that people want respite and relief. They even have voted Labour for that reason.
Less than 3 months since he became Prime Minister, Keir Starmer used his speech at the Labour Party conference to audition for a new role, Chief Bringer of Joy.
We will stabilise our economy, clear out the Tory rot, fix the foundation and deliver the mandate of change. A Britain built to last, built with respect, built with pride, because together we have shown that Britain belongs to you. Thank you, conference.
But after weeks of gloomy warnings about the economy and tough times ahead, was it enough to cheer up the nation? And perhaps more urgently, was it enough to win round Labour supporters who arrived at conference fed up with a slew of headlines about infighting in Downing Street and the row over freebies?
We spent the last 14 years complaining about the Tories and their freebies and their lack of consideration for other people, and then we kind of walked into a bit ourselves as a Labour government.
It doesn't smell right, particularly if you started fresh in government. So I think they kind of maybe misstepped in how they dealt with it.
I think it definitely demonstrates a lack of political nous and perhaps understanding what really matters to people, particularly coming through a cost of living crisis. I think it makes it particularly acute.
The first party conference after winning a landslide election victory should be a little less conference and a lot more party. But the mood has been less than celebratory amongst supporters in Liverpool.
I couldn't be more disappointed. I thought I was going to be really excited coming to this conference. I'm not excited. I feel quite flat. I feel, they've let us down really.
Is this the Keir Starmer you thought that you'd voted for?
No, it's not actually. I'm disappointed in him.
So how has Keir Starmer found himself afloat a sea of troubles so soon after his victory? And can he turn things around? The story today is the honeymoon over for Labour.
I'm Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent for The Times. I've been to Lib Dem conference, I'm currently at Labour conference, and I'll be going to Conservative conference next week.
Lucky you! You get the treble. I can hear the hubbub of conference right behind you.
Yeah, it's absolutely buzzing at the moment, and it's not just journalists working. There's a sort of press room where lots of the Labour aides will come in, and then suddenly a huddle will form where no journalists want to be sort of left out, so they start crowding round to hear what the exchange is.
Never a dull moment. Aubrey, this time last year when we had party conferences, there was a real sense at the Labour Party conference that power was probably headed their way. The halls were crowded, there were far more people than there were at the Tories. There was a sense of momentum. What's it like this time round?
So certainly party conference for Labour has been changing over the last few years. I've covered the Jeremy Corbyn leadership here when the types of people that are now in power in the Labour Party were the ones sort of shouting from the sidelines. And now they're suddenly in control, certainly very dominating. They have sought to reduce the opportunities for them to be embarrassed. Several of the unions have been trying to propose a motion to oppose Rachel Reeves's cut to the winter fuel allowance. But so far, broadly, this has been a successful conference for Labour. They've managed to sort of hammer home their messages, and they've left without attracting too much criticism.
You put it together at the end, but it doesn't sound plain sailing. Not the way you'd expect at this stage, where, they should just be coming together to celebrate an election victory, really, and yet there's already trouble in paradise. What have been the sort of conversations you're hearing on the edges? I know with party conferences, the best bits always happen late at night in the bar. What are the most surprising conversations you're hearing?
Yeah, it has been really interesting. I mean, I was speaking to Labour figures who say actually they think conference this year has felt relatively flat. And I think that's probably because last year, as you mentioned, there was this huge kind of momentum, positivity and optimism about what the party could do in government. And now they're very much confronted with what they would say is the difficult realities in front of them. So actually, you are starting to hear more and more conversations from Labour people about being sort of jittery, feeling worried that this might be a one-term Labour government and that they might get to the end of the 5 years, look back and ask, have they really sort of made the most of it?
I mean, Aubrey, that's quite surprising at this stage. You're a couple of months into a new government and they're already worrying about losing the next election. Just give us a sense, an independent, standing back sense of where they're at in terms of the polling. I mean, what does the electorate make of their chances at the moment?
Labour is facing a sort of uphill battle. So I think there's polling from Ipsos, which found that a quarter of Labour voters are disappointed by what Labour have done in government so far. And Keir Starmer's own approval ratings have obviously declined significantly as well. Only 25% of those who were surveyed believe that he is doing a good job as Prime Minister, down 11 percentage points from July in the immediate aftermath of the election. So they have obviously made, to some extent, a political choice to try and front load the political pain by blaming all of the issues that they say they've inherited on the previous government and saying that they need to take tough decisions in order to fix the gaps in the public finances.
Now, I know that you are impatient for change. I am too. But conference, because of that legacy left by the Conservatives, the road ahead is steeper and harder than we expected.
But that does come with a risk. And there's lots of new Labour MPs here, more than 200 of them. They haven't been through the bad years of Labour with the party as members of Parliament. So the risk is that they sort of get spooked quite early on, they get jittery, and then the sort of machine starts to falter.
I mean, Aubrey, that is quite a steep decline in the course of a couple of months, most of that being summer, to have disappointed a quarter of not just the general vote, but a quarter of Labour voters of their sort of more party faithful. That seems like a lot in very little time. Remind us of what this government, since they've taken office, what have they actually done? What have they managed to achieve? What are the sort of victories that they would point to?
This was the message communicated to frontbenchers in a meeting run by Morgan McSweeney, who's the political director of Number 10, and Pat McFadden, who is the most senior Cabinet Office Minister. They were saying to ministers going into this conference, we need to be more vocal about the successes and victories we've already had since coming into government. So they would be, Labour argues, ending the Rwanda scheme, announcing that the Bibi Stockholm barge will close next year, accepting the pay rise for junior doctors to end strikes in the NHS. And they've obviously passed their first piece of legislation, which was about ensuring that when the government does budgets, that the Office for Budget Responsibility is consulted. It sounds boring, but it was basically Labour's way of ensuring that Liz Truss's approach couldn't be done again, of ignoring the OBR. And other things they've done are beginning the processes to renationalise the railways and renters' rights. So all of those things, obviously, Labour figures are feeling pretty happy about, but the message is it's going to get worse before it gets better. All we've had is the sort of mood music, the headline from Rachel Reeves about the extent to which she's either going to have to cut public spending, raise taxes, or squeeze the size of the welfare bill.
Departments have been allocated money that they were spending, but which did not exist. The money was not there. A £22 billion black hole, which, if not tackled now, will pose risks for years to come.
So exactly how she does that is very, very delicate for the government.
We cancelled road and rail projects promised by the Conservatives, but which they did not budget for. And I made the choice to means test the winter fuel payment so that it is only targeted at those most in need. I know that not everyone in this hall or in the country will agree with every decision that I make. But I will not duck those decisions.
the winter fuel allowance saving from cutting it is about £1.5 billion. There's a long way left to go of that £22 billion of other potentially politically contentious decisions that she is potentially going to face quite a big backlash for.
It is interesting. I mean, that list that you've run through, by most government standards, that would be seen as quite a success in very little time. And yet, the mood music, the vibes seem to be off. Part of it is because of the way, as you said, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer seem to be talking the prospects of our economic growth. They seem to be talking the economy down. There's also a whole host of issues that have arisen. Just remind us, going into this party conference, of the various problems that they've brought in with them, the issues that are causing real disquiet amongst the party.
Absolutely. The biggest frustration among senior Labour figures with the government is what are called unforced errors, which it seems that the previous Conservative governments really just kind of naturally attracted. There were so many Tory MPs endlessly frustrated and saying, why are we making life harder for ourselves? Actually, now Labour MPs are saying much the same thing about their approach to being in government, because don't forget, they're less than 100 days in. So the issues that are kind of surrounding them coming into this conference are first and foremost the difficulty with sort of batting off Sleaze allegations. Those sorts of issues are really sort of clouding Downing Street, because Sir Keir Starmer, when he was leader of the opposition, made such a virtue of being whiter than white and criticising the Tories for all misdemeanours. Then they've also got the difficulty of infighting within Number 10. The row over Sue Gray, who's Labour's Chief of Staff in Downing Street, her pay being £170,000, while at the same time many of the special advisors she looks after were seeing their pay being cut, has really caused ruptures. And the level of incendiary, aggressive briefing from inside Number 10 and amongst senior Labour special advisors was really quite remarkable so soon into government. And then the wider concerns that the government isn't being more optimistic and positive enough to give people a reason to hope and presumably vote Labour at the next election.
That's so interesting. So you've got a whole host of issues there. The unforced errors, you've got the doom and gloom. And as you say, there's the really aggressive briefing against one character in the centre of government, and that's Sue Gray. Just remind us of exactly what her role is. What does a Chief of Staff do in government? How vital is she to the operation?
Well, a Chief of Staff is effectively the Prime Minister's primary political advisor. They are there to try and make the hour-by-hour and minute-by-minute decisions so that the Prime Minister can be focused more on bigger strategic decision-making. She is, of course, very knowledgeable about the systems and processes, the sort of gears that can slightly be very hard to move in the civil service when it can feel like trying to turn a tanker round, because she was, for a long time, a very senior civil servant. So she is, to a certain extent, filling a difficult role, because the Chief of Staff can sometimes be viewed as a bit of a bogeyman. In previous administrations, it was Dominic Cummings. Those people have sometimes attracted a lot of criticism, but it is kind of their job to knuckle down, to insulate the Prime Minister and just make them focused and concentrated on the things they think should matter, instead of being buffeted around by that day's noise or news or headlines.
So she should be the anchor to the whole thing, the enforcer in Number 10. We don't normally talk about the salary of the Chief of Staff in Number 10. Why has this become such an issue?
No, we don't. And actually, I mean, when you take a sort of broader view of this, she makes relatively little in comparison to other senior civil servants. But what was so interesting was the huge row that it created. And it all started with an article I wrote for The Times about 2.5 weeks ago, which was that Labour special advisors were going to unionise over discontent with their pay and conditions. Effectively, when the government was formed on July the 5th, it was a bun fight. People were desperate to get jobs in government. They moved into Number 10, all their government departments, and they started work. And during that process, they were put on a holding salary so that they could be sort of added to payroll, while their actual salary was going to be negotiated. And they had to write effectively their own job descriptions and submit CVs. And those would be scrutinised by the Special Advisor People Board, and that would ultimately make decisions about how much each Special Advisor was going to be paid. And I heard so many complaints from Labour spads who were saying, I'm being paid less than I was in my last job when I worked for the Labour Party in opposition, and I'm being paid less than Conservative predecessors who were doing this job. Meanwhile, Sue Gray is setting records as the highest paid Chief of Staff in Downing Street ever, we're told. Although, actually, if you adjust for inflation, it's probably about in line with where you might expect it to have got by this point. Now, this all was potentially a fairly innocent process because the civil service were trying to redress a sort of imbalance in the pay for special advisors, that the effect of it was to cause a huge amount of upset, frustration, and a feeling of almost betrayal by those who felt like they'd worked really hard, given blood, sweat and tears, and then come into government and just been told, you're not going to be paid as much as you were before.
And Aubrey, I know you put all of this to the Cabinet Office when you published that story, and a spokesman told you that any decisions on SPAD pay and terms are made by officials and not political appointees, so Sue Gray shouldn't have had any influence on them. But the fact that her salary has been leaked to the press, the clear, palpable anger, the way she's being briefed against so aggressively, it does give us a sense of how Number 10 is functioning at the moment. Is this just about Sue Gray's salary, or is it also her governing style? I mean, how has she managed to make so many enemies so quickly?
The issue was that some people saw her as the sort of problem solver to all of their problems, and she was held up almost as this poster woman who would completely professionalise and transform the Labour Party so that it, being full of people who had not been in government before, was ready to take on the huge mantle of trying to get to grips with the big civil service machinery and get through quickly what it wanted to do. But you hear more and more complaints from Labour aides who say that they don't see that manifesting in a particularly productive way. Some of those I know who worked with Labour when they were in opposition on what their first 5, 10, 15, 20 days in government would look like. They were drafting up measures that the government could announce. They were viewed as basically quick wins. And they just kind of look around and go, well, here we are. It just feels as though all of that work hasn't materialised. So I think there is a frustration that Sue Gray was so focused on changing Labour and preparing the party for government, and now it's got here and things just feel a bit slow.
I suppose she's not very political, and culturally, her role in the civil service was never really to make friends, it was to hold other people accountable. Is that part of the problem? She just hasn't learnt how to win over the people she's working with, or how to get things done?
Sue Gray is certainly a wily operator. There is no way that she got to where she is and was through being naive or making enemies. Make no mistake, she's fearsome and she's got to the top because she knows how to play the game. She was very respected. But there is, I think, a concern amongst Labour insiders that she isn't political enough. Some of them I was speaking to during the pay row were saying, we've been in the trenches fighting for years together, and she is picking fights with friends she hasn't made yet. And that, I felt, was quite a drastic accusation to levy at her from a senior government source. So I should preface all of this by saying that when you speak to senior communications staff in Number 10, they deny that there is any kind of split or that either camp is responsible for briefing against the other. That's the disclaimer.
Funnily enough.
Now, there is a wider concern that there is a sort of split at the heart of government between Sue Gray on the one hand, who's really in charge of the government machinery, and Morgan McSweeney, who's Labour's political director, and is much more focused not just on the delivery aspect, but really on what Labour's story is and what it's telling voters, ultimately to set expectations so that the party can win again at the next general election.
So Aubrey, for Labour now, at conference, there's been a sense of trying to dispel all the doom and gloom. There's been lots of briefing and counter-briefing about Sue Gray. There are also questions being asked about the unforced errors and Keir Starmer's judgment, really, and what they show about how political he is. A lot of this comes from what now feels like a very old row. It's been going on for more than a week. I feel like we've heard an awful lot about the private lives of Mr. and Mrs. Starmer and the people around them. But just talk us through everything that we know in terms of the Freebie scandal and what's actually been claimed.
This really emerged due to fantastic reporting in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago. And it was revealed that Keir Starmer had received £107,000 in gifts and freebies, which was 2.5 times more than the next closest MP. One of the donors that was responsible for those gifts and freebies was Lord Ali, who was made a peer under the last Labour government. He's a businessman, and he has been able to donate lots of money to pay for Keir Starmer's suits, his glasses, and also dresses for Keir Starmer's wife, Victoria, to wear on public occasions. Then there's the question about the freebies that Keir Starmer's received. He has accepted tickets to pop concerts, to football matches, and even £20,000 worth of free accommodation. Angela Rayner had a holiday in New York, where I think the accommodation was paid for by Lord Ali.
I don't believe I broke any rules. I had the use of the apartment, and I disclosed that I had the use of the apartment. In fact, I think I was overly transparent because I think it was important, despite it being a personal holiday, because that person, as a friend, had already donated to me in the past for my deputy leadership.
So you're not sorry for doing that?
And so all of these have kind of raised questions about, are the rules being followed, which in most cases they were, because we know about these things because they were declared, although in some cases they weren't declared, and that's down to the diligent reporting of the Sunday Times. But then there's also this sort of smell test of, you promised a government of integrity and of the highest ethical standards. How does it look when you're accepting all of these freebies? And actually, the initial approach of Number 10 really seemed to be to hunker down, to try and ride out the storm.
In our country, there isn't a budget for the Prime Minister's clothes or his wife's clothes. In some countries, there's a substantial budget. I've just come back from America, where there is a substantial budget to ensure that the US President and the First Lady, their appearance can never be challenged. That is not the case in our country.
You're taking £300 from pensioners while wearing glasses that are worth £2,000. Is that fair?
I have in my mind's eye all those people across the country who elected this government in on a mandate for change.
Keir Starmer was interviewed several times about it in the last week and defended it. He didn't suggest that he'd sort of done anything wrong or that the system should change. And then it was only at the end of the week, on Friday evening, that Number 10 suddenly changed their tune. And as more ministers were being dragged into this row, they announced that the Chancellor and Angela Rayner wouldn't accept these freebies anymore.
Was there a sense of embarrassment about it at conference? Because this is when Labour ministers come up face to face with Labour supporters, the grassroots, the people who aren't being given huge freebies on a regular basis. How did that play out?
There is a sort of question to the background of all this of why now? Because this is not necessarily wholly new revelations. Keir Starmer and his top team are not alone in having accepted freebies or donations. It happened under Conservative ministers, and it happened under Labour ministers before that. So you have to sort of ask why the level of anger is where it is. I think there's two reasons for that. One, there are uncomfortable truths in politics which don't often get public airing or attention. And they can be from donations, they can be from lobbying, and huge sort of scandals can sometimes erupt out of them and draw uncomfortable attention to issues that Westminster doesn't like talking about or acknowledging. When they dominate the headlines, they can be really, really difficult. So I think that's the first point. The second is to say that at a time when we're hearing from Rachel Reeves about she's tightening the nation's belt and having to, look at tax rises, spending cuts, and moves to restrain the size of the welfare budget, is it a good look for politicians to be accepting donations of clothes? It just sort of feeds into that kind of one rule for us and another for everyone else. It looks a little bit out of touch, and I think there's a dissonance there which Labour have belatedly realised.
And in terms of the smell test, in terms of how it looks to the general public who are being told to tighten their belts, is this something that Sue Gray should have been across? You know, as somebody who looked after standards while she was in the civil service for such a long time, is this a miss on her part?
I think it's hard because as Chief of Staff, you are trying to deal with the biggest picture problems of the day. And sometimes it can be quite hard to tell where the next kind of mini movement suddenly turns into an avalanche. And that's probably what happened in this case, because as I said, this isn't a sort of new issue. It's the fact that Keir Starmer and his top team painted themselves as so whiter than white when they were in opposition that I think they created a rod for their own back by criticising the Conservatives for any misdemeanour. I suspect that Labour will wish they had got a handle on this sooner and that it hadn't taken them a week in order to put an end to it and kill the story by saying that they weren't going to accept these clothes anymore.
And on the face of it, Aubrey, I mean, these seem like big headlines for now, but sort of a bit of a mountain out of a molehill when it comes to the bigger political picture. You know, this probably isn't the sort of thing people are going to vote on in 2029, whether Keir Starmer and his wife accepted freebies. But as you say, so much of this, the reason it seems to be hitting home is because we're being given such a picture of gloom for the rest of the country. We know that was one of Labour's big aims. If they are going to try and win the country round again, they do need to give us a sense of hope and a sense of vision. Is that something that you think has been achieved at the party conference?
Well, it's difficult because when Labour were in opposition, party conferences were really a time for them to shine, and when actually they really relished the media attention and they could use it as a platform to make lots of announcements. In the words of one senior Labour advisor I was talking to earlier, this conference is very vibes heavy. And that's because, you know, the main questions that everyone wants to know the answers to are economic. And yet Rachel Reeves's budget is still 5 to 6 weeks away, meaning that we're just waiting to see exactly where the axe falls. And in that time, it's becoming a vacuum where people are painting more and more options about what could be cut or changed in order to fill the £22 billion black hole and restore Rachel Reeves's promise of economic stability. But yeah, I don't think you are hearing very many positive messages from people here. The slogan is change begins, but that is tempered by telling people that it isn't going to be too quick. And it's partly about setting expectations, as I said before, showing that Labour wants this to be a 10-year project. You know, in 5 years, fixing the foundations, and in 10 years, transforming the country. I am getting the sense that there is nervousness among some Labour officials and certainly some union bosses that they are concerned that Labour will get to the end of the 5 years and go, well, we delivered economic stability, but at what cost? Did we really come out of it feeling as proud of ourselves as we could?
That was Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent for The Times. And you can read more of Aubrey's work and all of our coverage from the party conferences at thetimes.com with a subscription. And if you're craving a daily dose of politics chat, then do have a listen to Times Radio's Politics Unpacked podcast. The producers today were Sam Chantarasak and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Marla Seto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Hopefully, it'll help others to find us. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.